I will be discussing remote sensing for biodiversity corridor conservation in southeast Queensland. Biodiversity corridors are an area of vegetation that allow animals to travel between patches of native environment. These corridors are vital to maintain/restore natural biodiversity as they allow for species movement between disconnected areas. In southeast Queensland, as can be seen in Figure 2, there are several key biodiversity corridors. Much of the land in these biodiversity corridors is not protected areas and borders on urban areas, such as the highlighted corridor near Toowoomba. These biodiversity corridors face several pressures from this. Firstly, many of these biodiversity corridors already intersect with roads, and with the lack of protected land and urban expansion, they risk being cut off entirely by this expansion. As shown in Figure 3, despite the recent decrease in land clearing, as of 2021, 35,000 hectares of woodland vegetation was still cleared. This, coupled with the lack of protection of biodiversity, the current lack of protection of biodiversity corridors, demonstrates that there is a threat to them. To address this issue, my suggestion is to use remote sensing to map both changes in land use and the types of vegetation present in that land use, such as dense vegetation, sparse vegetation, bare ground. This will be done in order to present a series of maps showing how land use changes over time and the biodiversity corridors that are cut off by roads to help implement future planning for urban area expansion and the introduction of mitigation strategies such as the one shown in Figure 4. The biophysical basis for using remote sensing in this regard is demonstrated by several points. Firstly, the Queensland Government already uses remote sensing to form the SLATS reports, which is a report on the land use, and the map shown in Figure 5 is an example of one such map produced showing the extent of woody vegetation. Furthermore, different vegetations have different spectral reflectances. These differences in spectral reflectance allow them to be allow you to tell them apart for them to be distinguished, as shown by Figure 9, which shows the difference in near-infrared spectral reflectance between broadleaf and coniferous forests. The requirements for our data would be, temporally, the image would need to take place at least once per month. This would be important as it would allow for the showing of how the vegetation changes throughout the year as seasons and temperature changes, as well as showing how the land use has changed throughout the year, such as clearing moving towards woodland vegetation. Spatially, the imaging must cover all of southeast Queensland, as the entire region is what I'm looking at with the biodiversity corridors, with a resolution of at least 50 by 50 meters. As shown by Figure 7, at this level, you can still distinguish between smaller features on the map, whereas at higher resolutions you begin to lose the ability to tell the difference between them. And the spectral requirements would be that it would image wavelengths from visible light to infrared, as the ability to distinguish between different types of vegetation is largely based in the infrared spectrum. As for the data selection for our purposes, we would be using Sentinel-2 data. As shown by Figure 8, it is already used to look at land use changes in Australia, and as can be seen, it does a good job of mapping the changes in even small areas. Sentinel-2 also uses multispectral analysis, covering all wavelengths of visible light and infrared, and can image Australia up to once every 5 days. Using these meet our criteria for data. The image on screen is an example of the process that would be taken to go from the data to a suitable land use map. Initially, NV would be used to manually select ROIs of different land covers, such as roads, dense vegetation, sparse vegetation. We would then assess the spectral signatures of these areas to ensure that they are sufficiently different to be distinguishable by an algorithm. If they are suitable, these would then be used to train a maximum likelihood classification algorithm, which would do the land classification to give a map. Maximum likelihood works by assuming that the stats for the different classes are normally distributed, and then finds the maximum likelihood of each pixel's classification based on that. The main weaknesses of this process would be that there is an assumption of a normal distribution, and should that be false, then land may be misclassified, and also that with the ROI selection, there is an error of human error, and also issues with environmental interference with the imagery. To validate our outputs, we would take in situ measurements at a variety of randomly selected points on the biodiversity corridors in the South East Queensland, and we would then compare that to the classification produced by our algorithm. We would use this to form a confusion matrix, which would allow us to see where the largest errors were, and we would look to potentially reclassify certain ROIs to ensure that the data is useful. To present our findings, we would produce a series of land cover maps throughout, showing the changes across the year, as this would allow it to be seen where the biodiversity corridors are most threatened. If one area is constantly at a low level of vegetation, that would need prioritizing over somewhere that is dense during the summer but becomes more sparse during the winter months. We would also include the error matrix in our outputs, as this would allow the users to understand any potential limitations or where errors are likely to occur in the data. Thus, this would allow them to use the outputs to plan for further urban expansions and the inputting of mitigation structures. Thank you.